Welcome to Academic, a space for thoughtful conversation between two scholars. No headlines, no sound bites, just an exchange of ideas.
What brought you to alchemy in the first place?
Interest in learned esoterica, I would say. So I've studied history of science and ideas, idé- och lärdomshistoria in Swedish, and much of what is going on in early times has these interconnections, crossovers, and so on. It's an understudied field, and it has turned out that it's become revolutionized during these last 20 years or so. So it's been an interesting journey to be on in a part of that revolution of our knowledge of these areas, basically.
Those really are the best fields, right?
Yeah.
I think something similar could be said for the field of esotericism studies as well. That it's something that's been understudied for so long, and only in the last few, let's say, maybe 3 or 4 decades, has the academic lens really been turned towards that topic.
So, but you're not doing history of alchemy proper, right? You're doing history of esotericism. So that's alchemy as part of a wider cultural context.
Yeah, exactly. So alchemy is one of many components, of course, in this broader esoteric field. But it is one that is surprisingly recurrent, even in contexts where it might be a bit unexpected, perhaps, such as, let's say, Freemasonry, ritual magic, and so on.
So is it mostly symbolism, or is it also the laboratory practice, which is integrated into these other esoteric areas?
Well, I mean, it would mainly be the symbolic form of alchemy. Of course, focusing on the process of transmutation, and perhaps that's something that you could say something about the historical development of the notion of transmutation.
That's a big question, and I think that it's important to realize that there are so many different kinds of alchemies, and each kind of alchemy has its own notions of transmutation. So if you have a medieval alchemy, it's very much a rational process. And also in early modern times, you have these changes in the tradition, which makes it more subject to esoteric connections and thought. And eventually, alchemy transmutes into something which is more spiritual, more connected to symbolism, but that's towards the middle end of the 18th century. So speaking about transmutation, I would say that in the Western tradition, it's usually a rather rational process. The idea is that you transmute, say, mercury and various other substances into gold, so there you get gold as the final result through the philosopher's stone. But when you do that, it's a rational thing. It's completely a part of the normal way that things are happening in the universe. So it's really no different than doing a chemical experiment or following a recipe doing cooking. You just have to be so much better at what you're doing that it's really hard. But it's possible within the normal run of things. And then eventually, when we come to the late 17th century, people have worked so hard on this project for so many years. For 2 millennia, people have been working in the laboratories trying to transmute. And about that time, people start thinking that it's not enough to do this in this normal way. We need to have help from God. We need to have spiritual intervention for it to happen. And that's so there, somewhere there, the tradition starts to change into something different, and it becomes a form of esotericism. But I would say that most actors through most of the early modern period aren't really doing esotericism. They're doing something different. They're doing, in one sense, they're doing a protochemistry. But it would be really bad to say it's just protochemistry, because it also contains all of the symbolisms. It's built into a much wider sphere of doing and making and thinking. But I'm not so certain that that wider sphere of doing, making and thinking should be conceived on in esoteric terms. It's more like the general culture of early modernity, which accepted stuff like spirits and angels and trolls living in the mountains.
Yeah, exactly. So in that sense, even prior to this bifurcation of alchemy, you could say that the spiritual is present merely through the general worldview of the time, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have a few critics of that, or several critics, but they are a minority and they need to argue for their position. From the 18th century, it's kind of a switchover where the skeptics, the rationalists, they become the majority. So therefore, those who have that older or more esoteric kind of worldview, they are on the back foot.
And I guess there's an interesting backlash against alchemy with the Enlightenment, where it's lumped together with these various other types of things that are perceived as pseudosciences or...
Precisely.
Yeah.
And they're not necessarily connected at all. It's just a trash heap where you put everything which you don't believe in yourself, and you say that everything you don't believe in yourself, that's connected because it's stupid and worthless. But those traditions, all of those activities aren't really connected by themselves. We create those connections.
Of course, it's as many scholars have demonstrated, it's a process of defining what is proper science, proper religion, and what doesn't belong gets lumped together, and because of that, they end up being connected, end up forming these connections that perhaps weren't there in the first place.
Yeah. And I think that the whole notion of the Western esoteric tradition has received a little criticism on precisely this point, that it's a kind of constructed field. What's your view on that?
Well, I mean, in the sense that these things end up in the same trash can, it does become a field of its own because of this process and because of the actual historical connections that are formed. But in some cases, I mean, the connections are there prior to this process of defining it as bad science or bad religion. With something like alchemy, I mean, there is a connection between alchemy and ritual magic prior to this. If we think of figures like Heinrich Kunrat, for example.
But if we move on forward in time to your period, the period you're more interested in, where do we find these connections between alchemy and other activities?
Well, I mean, in a sense, they're all over the place. So I mean, alchemy is part of the symbolism in the Rosicrucian manifests, and alchemy is integrated into Masonic systems of initiation. But at that point, we have, of course, moved from the laboratory work to the transmutation as a symbolic process pertaining to, transmuting the self rather than creating gold or the philosopher's stone in a physical sense. And
would you place that in early Freemasonry, or where would this transition happen?
I think it's something that happens broadly across the field of esoteric currents, and that's the interesting thing with alchemy, right? That it runs as a sort of golden thread through all these esoteric currents.
But I mean, what do groups like Freemasons actually do with alchemy? What is it that they're doing? And I'm thinking about the Jungian interpretation, Carl Gustav Jung's interpretation of alchemy, as this kind of transmutation of the soul and a system which is basically built to transmute the human being and make the human being a whole person. But that is rather late.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. Jung's interpretation of it on the other hand, draws on these earlier esoteric understandings. So you find similar takes on alchemy in, for example, theosophy, where alchemy is related explicitly to the transmutation of the self and ascending to higher state as a spiritual being. So I mean that's not really an innovation of Carl Gustav Jung's. It's something that he draws from earlier esoteric sources. His innovation would be the continued drift towards a secular understanding of it, even though, of course, describing Carl Gustav Jung as a secular thinker is somewhat problematic. Yeah. But he sort of continues this drift in that direction, and others have taken that even further in this in the same direction, where it becomes perceived as completely just a symbolism describing a sort of integration of elements within yourself in a psychological sense without any metaphysical dimension.
So, but would you say that alchemy was big in the 19th century? Or was it kind of a small, insignificant current within the larger esoteric currents?
I would say that it's a significant component, a significant system of symbols still at that point. On the other hand, laboratory work as such had been devalued, and we have these famous descriptions of laboratory work, and those who indulge in it as sooty-faced empiricists, as opposed to the lofty alchemists who have a true understanding of what it's all about, and it's a purely spiritual process and has nothing to do with getting your hands dirty.
Yeah, but Strindberg was a laboratory worker, wasn't he?
Very much so, Strindberg. Absolutely, yeah. But of course, I mean, Strindberg as an occultist is such an idiosyncratic figure, and he had his own understanding of pretty much every dimension of esotericism that he engaged with, including alchemy. And for Strindberg, I think the central point that he wanted to prove through alchemy was the notion of monism, and monism for Strindberg was the idea that all matter is just one substance, and he attempted to prove that through his alchemical experiments. But Strindberg being Strindberg, he hoped for some recognition from mainstream scientists as well, which never came, not too surprisingly. But French alchemists and esotericists appreciated his experiments. So in that sense, he was successful.
Yeah, I think I remember that he was made head of the alchemical department at some kind of esoteric university, which kind of existed, but perhaps not in Paris.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons, of course, why the French occultists were so enthusiastic about Strindberg's experiments would have been not necessarily that the experiments in themselves were so successful and convincing, but the cultural prestige attached to a figure like Strindberg was attractive for them.
He was famous already when he was in Paris hanging out with the occultists.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But returning to this notion of alchemy as a transmutation of the self, to what extent would you say that this was present in let's say, Swedish alchemy prior to the 18th century?
It's difficult to say, really, because you would have to go into specific people doing specific things. But my sense is that most people who were working on this earlier, in the earlier period, they were the Sooty empirics, and were trying in various ways to integrate theoretical thinking about matter into the mining industry, basically to provide the Swedish mining industry with a theoretical framework. And the theoretical framework to reach for was the alchemical one. So if you wanted to understand practical processes going on in smelting works, alchemy was the way these were interpreted and understood. So people were working with some of the major schemes, like the sulfur mercury scheme, where metals are made by the combination of these two exhalations from the interior of mountains. One of them is sulfuric in nature, and the other is mercurial in nature. And when these two combine, this creates the metals and the ores. And the whole process of alchemy is really a way of making natural processes in the laboratory by combining these two substances in the correct way, using various transmutation agents as an aid in that process. So nothing magical, nothing esoteric is happening here, just move on. So that's one kind of interpretation. But then again, you would have these bigger cultural frameworks where this kind of work, to quite a large extent, depended on God's grace. But on the other hand, everyone who wrote a book in the 17th century asked for God's grace in completion of that work.
So you would say it was perhaps an empty formality in some cases?
In some cases, but in many cases not. But what you see towards the end, again, of the 17th century is that people start to reframe this in a more religious way. And that the way that religion seeps into the alchemical processes happens in certain groups of religious free thinkers, and they are deeply connected with the people who are doing alchemy. So you see that pietists are absolutely central in the transition from a more practical laboratory-oriented alchemy into one which is more dependent on symbolism and religion. But you also have these currents going back further. So you have in the Lutheran discourse, all the way from Reformation, you see a use of alchemical imagery describing the journey of the soul towards God and stuff like that. So it's all there, but it's not kind of especially important for specifically alchemy because it's all over the place. And alchemy can be brought into a religious discourse and is brought into a religious discourse. But what you see then, beginning 18th century, is that the religious discourse becomes more and more interesting, more and more influential. And there you have this first kind of reframing of alchemy in pietist circles, I would say. And that happens in Stockholm. It happens in particular in the group connected to Urban Hjerne and his many sons and daughters, who are all pietists, and many of them are also alchemists.
But I guess this is also part of why historical alchemy has often been misunderstood, right? Where you have this disconnect from the context of the time, and then later on people come across these historical texts, but they don't have that broader sense of how would people have talked about purely chemical operations 200 years ago.
And this, you can see this also, that if you have, for example, a Jungian, Carl Gustav Jung interpretation of alchemical imagery from the 17th century, and you say, yes, this is the journey of the soul towards wholeness, you would say. But you can find similar images in a book which describes processes, and the end product is fireworks.
Right. On the other hand, I'm sure someone would interpret fireworks as the
exactly. So you can do that,
God.
and that's where you get into historical replication, because if you actually use the images, use the descriptions, and then you produce a nice piece of firework and you shoot it into the sky and it explodes, then you have shown, this was a recipe for making good fireworks. And this is what many historians of early modern alchemy have been doing in the last 20 years or so, especially Lawrence Principe.
But if I am to play the devil's advocate as a historian of religions here, then couldn't this still be interpreted as a parallel inner process, in spite of the end result being spectacular fireworks? Does that have to exclude the other interpretation. What would you say?
Absolutely not. It doesn't need to exclude each other. And I think that is a valid interpretation. Absolutely. And I also think that it's so clear that you see in practice many alchemists who retire into, I mean, it's like a film. They retire into their basements. They retire into their homes. You don't see them anymore going out. They are just completely immersed in the great work. And of course, that is a spiritual activity and not just a nerd hiding in the basement. So absolutely, the spiritual component, I think it's always there, and it has significance. But it's a tricky business to do spiritual things during early modernity, because either you need to have your stuff from the angels, or you get it from the other side. And if someone thinks you get it from the other side, you're in deep trouble. So therefore, there's also these cultural reasons to be very careful to speak about your activities as in religious terms, which of course is part of the interpretation, why it's hidden in images and why it's hidden in hidden language, because you avoid persecution in that way.
And that in itself probably forms a large part of the continuing appeal of alchemy, the enigmatic symbolism. And to an extent, I guess, if the understanding of what, let's say, the red dragon, what does that symbolize in purely chemical terms, had that understanding been better earlier on, perhaps alchemy wouldn't have taken off the way it did as a system for symbolizing transmutation of the soul.
Yeah, could absolutely be like that. But I'm thinking also, I mean, when we talk about symbols, the meaning of symbols also change over time. And I would guess that's the case also for alchemical and esoteric symbolism. So if you have a five-pointed star with a circle around it, that would mean something for someone in one epoch and mean something completely different in another. Or would you say that there's this continuity of esotericism which runs in the symbols?
I would say that symbols are in themselves always multivalent. So even within a specific time and cultural context, a given symbol would be multivalent, and that's the power of symbols, that you can't really lock them in. They always open up in different directions. The malleability of symbolism is what makes it attractive in a sense. And another theme that I think is interesting with alchemy is the relationship between alchemy as a learned practice and how that then connects to, let's say, folk practices. And a prime example of that would be Paracelsus, who was so interested in folk magic and folk medicine. And sometimes there's, been something of a false dichotomy between learned esotericism and folk magic, if you will. And I'm interested in how that plays into the longer history of alchemy. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that alchemy has this thing for it, that you don't need to go to a formal school to become an alchemist. There were no universities. It wasn't learned, taught as part of a curricula formally. And that made it an open field, not for everyone, because you needed resources, you needed knowledge, but anyone could say, I'm an alchemist, I can do this. And that would include also women. So as long as alchemy functions as a valid form of knowledge, and it does that until the early 18th century, you can have women practicing it, you can have anyone, a farmhand, deciding, I will go to town, I will call myself an alchemist, I will try to sell my knowledge to this prince, and this happens. So it's a tool in a very concrete sense to transform your identity, because it permits you to enter spheres of action and social interactions which wouldn't be available to you if without alchemy. So it's a way to transform your social position by means of knowledge. And it's important to think of it as that. And when alchemy becomes chemistry, which is a long process, chemistry becomes a school subject, and chemistry becomes a university subject, and you have exams in chemistry. And what happens then is that it immediately excludes women, because they do not have a place in scientific academies and at universities. And it immediately becomes much more of a high status, upper class and middle class enterprise.
But on the other hand, hasn't alchemy always required some monetary resources? It's a somewhat expensive activity, right?
Absolutely. But so you would need those. You need to approach a prince or a king or a nobleman and say, I will make gold for you. I will solve all your economic problems, but it will take me a couple of years. And in the meantime, I need this really fancy laboratory, and you need to buy all the chemical equipment and stuff for me.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's the standard story that rich people get approached in this way.
And also the standard tragedy for many alchemists when they don't produce the desired results.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's exactly true, but supposedly there was even a punishment in German lands for the failed alchemist. He was to be hung from a gallows which was plated with or painted in gold.
Well, let's say that's true. It's a beautiful legend, regardless. Yeah. But perhaps that is something of a divide then between folk practices and alchemy, that you require, all this complicated laboratory equipment and these expensive substances for it. So maybe that is actually something that separates the two, even though, of course, they intermingle in various ways.
Yeah. And I would guess that, working purely with symbols and with books, that's cheap science. It doesn't cost very much to be a theoretical mathematician. You need a pen and you need a paper. And same, if you sit around with your esoteric symbols, that's not so much cost associated with that. But if you want to build a big reactor and try out various nuclear experiments, that's costly business. If you need a big chemical laboratory, that's costly business. So you need your patrons. And in the early modern period, those patrons would have been royals mostly and noblemen.
And you need the time to do these operations, right? Since many of them, take place over an extended period of time. And if you're, let's say, a farmhand, you wouldn't be able to set that time aside.
No, exactly. So it's demanding on all levels.
And I guess with something like esotericism in general, the tendency has been for it to be sort of an upper middle class and upper class activity. And there's an amusing description of theosophy in the Swedish newspaper Svenska Dagbladet around 120 years ago, where it's described as an upper class sect. And there's something to that, but on the other hand, there's always this connection to folk practices and folk magic. And in the context of alchemy, would you say that there's a tendency for alchemists to want to, construct themselves as persons of learning and distancing themselves from folk practices?
I think that distinction, again, returning to early modernity, I think that distinction really doesn't apply, because there is no folk practice in that sense in alchemy. Alchemy is a field, and if you join, you're an alchemist. If you're thrown out, you're no longer an alchemist. So I think it's alchemy is valid among all groups, but then you can be a very poor alchemist, poor in the sense that you don't have any money. So then you need to apprentice or connect to someone who's a richer alchemist. And alchemy also connects to the traveling medicine salesmen, the quacks or mountebanks. So if everything fails for you doing the great work on metals, you can always just buy a few ingredients from your local apothecary and then sell them as the universal elixir. So you can actually be a quack doing alchemy, but then you move into the medical side, because it's as one of the Swedish alchemists said, Count Gustav Bonde. He said, wrote to a friend that I never worked on the metallurgical work because it demands all your time, all your attention, and all your money. I don't think he said money really, because he had so much money. But so he never actually worked himself on transmuting metals, and instead choose to work on his body with an alternative method of producing the Philosopher's Stone.
Yeah, I mean, it's an inner alchemy in a very different sense, what Gustav Bonde did. And I mean, it's been analyzed as a transgressive practice by a Swedish historian of ideas called Mikael Edenborg.
Yes.
And he has really emphasized the sort of the grotesque dimensions of what Bonde did, and what he did specifically, of course, was to swallow this pearl of gold and let it pass through his digestive system repeated times in the hope of producing the Philosopher's Stone through this.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, I mean, this may seem as a completely absurd practice, but I mean, I have been thinking that if you think of it as a form of meditation, and also a transgressive practice to actually eat something which has passed through your system. I think you're supposed to do this for 3 years in a completely calm state of mind, and after that you receive the Philosopher's Stone. And to me that sounds like some Indian religion, for example, where you would have these ascetics doing similar things. Would you think that connections like that would be possible to make?
Well, I mean, I think it unlikely that Bonde would have been aware of, let's say, tantric practices, but the sort of the general tendency is recurring in many different religious contexts, and this notion of transgression as a means to transcend the earthly and reach the higher spiritual realms. So in that sense, it's part of a long-standing tradition, I guess. But another parallel could be Chinese alchemy and Taoist practices to achieve immortality. Again, something that I suppose it's unlikely that he would have been aware of.
Never say never.
Never say never, of course.
I think it's absolutely conceivable that there were connections between esoterically inclined alchemists, which connected, perhaps not directly Europe and China, but via India, via the Islamic world. But such connections would be very, very invisible in sources. So but we could hypothesize that Bonde actually had connections, at least with some kind of tantric practices.
Yeah, but at the very least, the sort of the structural tendency is very similar. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you also do not need specific connections. You can discover things independently and do similar things for similar purposes.
But in terms of wealth, another fascinating dimension of the history of Swedish alchemy would be the attempts by August Nordenskiöld to break the tyranny of the monetary system by creating so much gold that it would become worthless. And I find it particularly amusing that he performed these experiments with royal patronage, where he was allowed to build this laboratory on royal grounds using royal money, and King Gustav III even sent him abroad to study alchemy. When his sort of ultimate utopian goal, his end game, if you will, was actually breaking the monetary system.
Yeah, that's ironic and fun.
But of course, it also speaks to the sort of historical tendency for these utopian fantasists to move in these upper class circles.
Yeah, and but also it's activities which require a lot of time and expenditure tend to be limited to people who actually have those resources. And there's also the added thing that you need to have a self-image which permits you to take the stage, so to speak, in an enterprise of any kind. And that's mostly, it's easier for someone who has an upbringing which permits these things. But of course doesn't at all exclude people who are basically the sons of poor peasants and occasionally perhaps even the daughter of a poor person to take up a field like alchemy. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about alchemy that we don't think about so much anymore, is that it was a tool for transformation of the social self, which permitted people to become something which they weren't brought up to be in the very, very strict and hierarchical society, which was the early modern society.
And in a sense, I guess that's a general phenomenon within other esoteric currents as well. That these esoteric practices, they can function as a means of climbing the social ladder. And with something like Freemasonry, you have this dimension of eliminating social hierarchies within this delimited context, where everyone is a brother. Even the king himself potentially is to be addressed as your brother in the Masonic Lodge. However, women were mostly excluded from the Masonic community, even though early on there were lodges that accepted women as well. So perhaps that potential is inherently there in many of these esoteric currents. Later on, with something like Theosophy, naturally the sort of leadership roles offered women within that current was something unique at that time.
Yeah, and I think I absolutely agree with you. And I think Strindberg said that I would be a theosophist, but I would never join a movement which is led by women and brown men.
Yeah,
and so that's his racism and misogynic. But it's clear that you have esoteric currents of all kinds, I would say, as a tool of transformation, which we have undervalued because it's used mostly, and also similarly with witchcraft. Witchcraft is what is used by the oppressed in many cultures, not all. And I guess that's one of the reasons why the well-educated and the powerful want to talk about these things as worthless and stupid.
Yeah, the subversive dimension of esotericism. Yeah. But with someone like Strindberg, I mean, one of his main gripes with Theosophy and with spiritualism as well was that it functioned as a way for women to raise themselves to the same level or even a higher level than men. So his basic objection, I think, was misogynistic, and then with a sprinkling of the racism that runs through much of his writing.
Yeah. Strindberg is an interesting person, and I think most people who are aware, in Sweden at least, of alchemy kind of related to him. But I would say that is kind of a very late development. But do you think that contemporary alchemists, how do they work? What do they do? Is it Strindberg, or is it the reworking stuff, or is it mostly part of art?
Regarding Strindberg, I suppose no one has really continued his work in a direct sense. I mean, he didn't create a school of alchemy that became influential in any sense.
Thankfully.
Thankfully. He was always so idiosyncratic, right? But we have an alchemical academy here in Stockholm, which combines laboratory work with a very strong focus on the spiritual dimension of alchemy. But I mean, Strindberg's use of alchemy was not merely restricted to his sort of chemical experiments. There was also a dimension of it that pertained to his creative work, where it functioned as a sort of fuel for his writing. And that strand was picked up by, for example, the Parisian surrealists in the 1920s. And I mean, surrealism appears as a movement around 1920 with the first Surrealist Manifest. And then in the second Surrealist Manifesto from 1929, the main ideologist, André Breton, calls for the occultation of surrealism. And he also refers explicitly to alchemy and says that the goal of surrealism is similar to that of the alchemists. And for him, that entails a sort of liberatory practice and a liberation of fantasy and accessing fantasy. So he basically saw the alchemists as, fantasists, not necessarily in a sense that they would have appreciated very much, probably. And then alchemy became integrated into surrealism as part of the appropriation of a variety of esoteric practices that they employed to further creativity, to liberate mankind, really. So it's a rather lofty goal, again, with many surrealists having a sustained engagement with alchemy. For example, Max Ernst, who described his practice of creating collages as an alchemical technique.
So they would have appreciated Nordenskiöld's alchemy.
I mean, had the Parisian alchemists been aware of that, they would have loved it.
Yeah.
And of course, the Swedish surrealists, specifically the Stockholm surrealist group, they were very much into Nordenskiöld, and one of these people was Carl Michael Edenborg, who wrote that dissertation on Gustav Bonde. So in that sense, the history of Swedish alchemy really became integrated into Swedish surrealism through people like Carl Michael Edenborg. And he also wrote a rather entertaining novel, The Alchemist's Daughter. You should read the novel. It's a fun read.
Okay.
And of course, he really takes alchemy to its uttermost extreme there, with alchemy as a sort of practice that's aimed at destroying the universe, the ultimate liberation, right? Yeah. So it's a sort of a Gnostic fantasy where mankind is trapped in the material world, and the material world has to be destroyed through advanced alchemical experiments. So that's next level Nordenskiöld, I guess. Not just destroying the economy, destroying the universe.
Yeah. Thanks for this conversation.
Thank you, Hjalmar. It's been a pleasure.
It was really interesting.